All right, welcome back to the channel. I know that this video has been long awaited, and this is the finale of my side deck card tier list. So we're doing traps today. And yeah, there are a lot more traps than there are monsters and spells that people side. So there's a lot to cover here. This video will be a bit longer than the other two. But I think there's a lot of good content to be talked about on this one, especially because recently I mentioned in a video that Pulling a Rug is now the #1 side deck card in Edison in terms of representation. So I think it was Peak of the Beak 4. They had the chart up on Format Library, and it showed that the #1 side deck card is now Pulling the Rug, just by quantity. But I think that that's very telling that that card is very, very versatile. And so we could just start off immediately putting this in S tier. I do think that this is one of the absolute best cards against frogs. I know people think about siding things like Masker Restrict and DD Crow and all that stuff, but all of those cards are way more situational, in my opinion, than Pulling a Rug. And what Pulling a Rug actually does to the deck is essentially skips your turn. So when you summon a Caius or summon a Riser or summon a Drunk Synchron or Swap Frog or whatever, and it gets Pulling a Rug, that's typically the end of your turn, unless you specifically have Miracle Fusion in the Hero Frog deck. And I'm going to be referencing, if I talk about frogs, I'm talking about Hero Frogs, because that is the most dominant frog deck now. But yeah, this is probably the best card against that deck overall. It also happens to cover other matchups. Like, I think it's good against Diva Hero, because Diva Hero gets caught with their Stratos, their Divas, their Caiuses, and those are all of their big plays if you look at it. Like, if you look at a Diva Hero deck list, their main plays are coming from those three monsters. So cutting those off is extremely important. And I think it's also applicable in other matchups too, even though you don't see those matchups as much. Like maybe against Machina Control or Quick Draw, the same thing, because they play like Debris Dragons or Caiuses, Machina Gear Frame, stuff like that. So it might be better than some other cards that you already have in the main deck. It's not my go-to against those matchups, but it's something that you could side in if you had something else weaker. I think right now another S tier side deck card is Torrential Tribute. This is a little biased, I guess, because I've been siding this in the Frog deck and it has performed so well for me because no one respects it in the side deck. So like if you play against a deck that you know typically does main deck Torrential, then people will always play around Torrential in every game. But I think because frogs are not known to play a card like Torrential, I mean they are now, right? Cat's out of the bag. But in the last several months before I started topping with Torrential and frogs, I think that it was a card that caught a lot of people off guard, and even still I'm noticing people don't really play around it.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Torrential and frogs too. That's so clutch right there. That torrential is so clutch.
So that's really, really strong to me. Like if you can side something that people know about, but they still just for some reason do not care, that's worth its weight in gold. This card always trades favorably. It's always a 2-for-1 at minimum. Like I've never had to use it on one monster. It always gets a second monster or more, which is crazy. I think it's just because of the deck that I'm playing that people don't expect the back row to be that real. Like I guess they're just reading Raigeki Break or Dust Tornado every time, and it's just Torrential. So but yeah, Torrential's insane. I don't think many decks really side it. Like most decks that would play this card would just main it, but yeah, as a side deck card, it's absolutely S tier because the decks that are siding it is because people don't expect them to have it in the first place. I think a slept on card, I'm gonna put this in A tier, is Fiend Comedian. This card's actually insane, and I feel like enough people do not know how devastating it can be. So if you win the coin flip or die roll, whatever, with this card, it banishes your opponent's entire graveyard. And if you lose the coin flip or die roll, then it will mill the same number of cards that they have in their graveyard from the top of your deck. So basically Lightsworn and Phoenician Cluster Amaryllis, Burn deck or whatever, they side this card because both the things that can happen are really beneficial to them typically. So like against Hero Frogs, if I'm playing Lightsworn and it's standby phase and they go to bring back Treeborn Frog, and let's say both of them are in the graveyard, they could just activate Fiend Comedian, and if it banishes the entire graveyard, that's insane. But even if it mills like 10 cards, that's also insane for that deck. I've been a really big fan of this card ever since I got hit by it at Nationals, and also way back when I think the Amaryllis deck first premiered, I was playing it on DB just to test it before I realized how real that deck was. And when I would activate this card, I was like, man, that's actually so sick that I just banished this guy's entire graveyard with one card, making it super awkward. Like imagine playing against Value or something, and same thing, like you just banished their whole grave. So big fan of this one. I'm putting it in A tier. I genuinely think that it's a lot better than people realize. So yeah. A card that this is from old Edison. This is like bottom of the barrel. It's not really playable. Same thing with Mirror of Oaths. Like both of these cards are just absolutely terrible. And the only time you ever see those in Edison is probably in the 2010 deck list. If you look at the top 16 decks from SJC Edison, they were citing these, and I get it because I think that Glad Beasts were better then than they are now. Like people just didn't know how shit that deck was back then, and deck building as a whole was different. So these cards are both anti-Glad Beast cards. Swallow Flip and Mirror of Oaths They're definitely not the best cards. Like, they're very limited in what they actually hit. And I think it's safe to say that in any given tournament, Glad Beasts are not going to be one of your matchups usually. Like, if it is, it's probably going to be like rounds 1 or 2. But even then, like, most of the decks just deal with those decks really well. So yeah, these cards are not very good. I could see if maybe Rescue Cat became a better deck or something, then maybe Mirror of Oaths would be a little bit more playable. But then again, it's still just so narrow. It's such a narrow card. Another S tier side deck card is Deck Devastation Virus. So I know that like right now, a lot of people are not citing it as much as they were earlier in the year and all of last year, because the decks that this card is good against are kind of super checked by it, so they're not played as much. One of them is fairies. Like, this card is an FTK or OTK or whatever against fairies. It just completely decimates that deck. And tournaments have been won this year where a person has been citing 3 copies of Deck Devastation Virus in Blackwings. I think it was hybrid Blackwings to be exact. And it makes a lot of sense to me because one of your not so favorable matchups with Blackwings is the fairy deck. So if you just side 3 of this, it just completely cooks that matchup. And the same could be said about like if gadgets really did become that much of a problem. Deck Devastation Virus keeps that deck in check too. I think that people don't really understand how absurd it is to resolve this card. It's really, really degenerate. Like, Crush Card Virus was wild, and in Edison form, I think Deck Devastation Virus is wild. We've seen people like a True Hero maining this card in 2023 in certain decks, and I am not opposed to that. I actually like it a lot game 1 because frogs really have all of their cards that can get hit game 1, and then sometimes they get sided out depending on the matchup and stuff like that. So there's typically more cards that get hit game 1 than are games 2 and 3 because people expect you to side this anyway. But even still, I think the reason why I have such a high esteem for this card is because of the information you get from it too. Like, most games where a good player trap dust shoots someone, they're going to win, not just because of whatever trap dust shoot put back, but also just because of the information game. And Edison is essentially just a huge information war. So once you know what your opponent has, you know they have Bottomless, you know they have Deepers, you know they have Torrential, etc., you can really play around their cards and just maximize all of your cards to trade favorably with theirs. And this shit lasts for 3 turns. Like, that is by far the most egregious thing. It lasts for 3 turns. That is so many turns to know exactly all of your opponent's cards. So unless you brick after you activate DDV, you're probably just going to win the game off of the knowledge you got for that turn and the following 2 turns, on top of destroying certain cards. So they might skip their draw phase. You might have hit a ton of cards when it activated. It's just a lot. It does a lot. I want to talk about Shadow Imprisoning Mirror because I think that this card isn't as bad as most of us have thought in the past when it comes to Edison format. So I've seen this card be side decked by Hero Beat against Value Turbo and one of the Beast Mode Circuit Series tournaments. And I was like, man, that actually is really crippling him because the guy had like maybe double Value engraved in a Sirocco or something, and he went to activate it and this got chained, Shadow Imprisoning Mirror. And it did the most. It just stayed there pretty much that entire game, and I think that was really the end of it. So the fact that it stops things like Caius and Value and Gale and Plague Spreader Zombie, it hits a lot of things. I think this card is way better than we give it credit for. Also, dark monsters in general are probably the most popular in the format, so it's pretty good. I think the only issue that I have with it though is that not many decks can actually side Shadow Mirror without hurting themselves. So the only decks that really do side this card would be something like Gadgets or Hero Beat. Maybe the Phoenician Cluster deck could side it as well, like Plan decks could side it. But a lot of the other S tier decks could not side this, right? Like, frogs can't side a continuous card like this. Zombies would not side this either. Blackwings wouldn't side it. But for the decks that actually can get away with putting this in their side deck, yeah, it's pretty good. Like, I'm not mad at seeing this card, specifically against things like Value. I think is really good, and also against zombies. Stopping Goblin Zombie is pretty much the whole game. Like, if you can make that card not search, that's huge. So I'm going to do a couple at one time right now. I'm going to do Decree, I'm going to do Trap Stun, and I'm going to do 7 Tools of the Bandit. So these are going in descending order and what I think their power level represents. So Decree is just an insane card. Like, if you're siding this card against the matchup, it means that that deck is playing a lot of traps, and this is a win button. Like, the second you activate Decree on the end phase against a deck that just set like 2 or 3, it's probably game. Like, 99% of the times it's just straight up game on that turn. So this one doesn't really need much like explanation. I think that if you've ever played the trap deck and had somebody flip Decree on you, you know exactly what it feels like, and it does not feel good. It's at 2 in the format for a reason. Very, very powerful card. I actually was saying recently in RBET Moreno Valley that if Decree was at 3, the format would be different, because decks that could main 3 copies of this card would be more popular, and they would be more consistent. And so if you have consistent decks that have a 40% chance of opening Decree and they can just play a shit ton of monsters and get away with it, like, the format is just way different, because a lot of the S tier decks play a lot of traps. Like, look at Value, Blackwings, and Hero Beat. They play a lot of traps. But if the Kree was at 3, decks like Lightsworn could main deck 3 copies of it, and who knows whatever stuff people would brew where they could rely on drawing it in their opening more consistently than it being at 2. Trap Stun is also very, very good. I've seen Frog decks now siding Trap Stun and Mobius and stuff like that, and that's cute. I like it also for zombies because I was talking to Nazar Sarhan and he had the idea that Trap Stun is good in that side deck because you get oppression and then you chain Trap Stun to it. You make your field, you blow your opponent out that turn with either a lot of damage or flat out OTK them. But if you don't, you pass and then you have a field and they still have that oppression up. And then from there, there's a lot of different things that could have happened. Their life points could have been dropped so low that they can no longer even pay for oppression, and or they're in a situation where they need to special summon now, but they can't to deal with your field. And so they end up losing the game that way. So in that way, like Trap Stun is a reversal against oppression decks. He basically was saying, I don't want to get rid of the oppression. I want to leave it there, but I want to play my turn out with it nullified and then have them try to come back and play through their own oppression. I like that idea a lot. This card also is the only way that you can play Glad Beast, in my opinion. Like, Trap Stun is really good in that deck because you can just pop all the cards in one turn with Bestiari and then Jaizaris. 7 tools, I like it. I think the only decks I really see play this are decks that are really weak to DDV because they need to negate that card specifically. But I'd argue that you probably just want to play Trap Stun in that case. The 1,000 life points is actually kind of steep. So I don't like this card as much for a couple of reasons. One, you have to set it because it's a trap. But 2, you're probably only looking to negate like 1 or 2 different cards in the entire deck, and then it costs life points to do it, and it only negates 1 card. Now granted, it is a spell speed 3, so it's going to end the whole chain, but like, again, life points are a huge thing in Edison format, and the fact that this card only stops 1 thing is like, okay, it's like, I get it. You need to hit the DDV. If you have Dust Tornado set and you're playing fairies, you don't want to try to in-phase snipe it and miss. But I think if your goal is to stop cards like that, then Trap Stun is better. But yeah, I mean, fairies can wall up pretty well. So like I said, the only deck that can probably get through with playing this is the fairy deck, I imagine. I've seen other decks side it, but I don't really agree when they do. I think Dust Tornado is a solid like A tier. Now, a lot of people side this card, including myself. I don't think it's on a level of the S tier cards. Like, it is a very, very good card. Don't get me wrong. And it's probably like the second most side decked card in the format, or the third most. But it's in terms of power level, like, it's not an S tier power level card. It's just like more destruction against problematic things like Royal Oppression and all that stuff. So skill drain. But I wouldn't say that Dust Tornado just flat out wins you the game when you flip it. Like, if you look at a lot of these other cards in S tier cards, when you flip them, they kind of like end the game a lot of the times if you look at these. And that's the point. So with that being said, another S tier card I would say is Skill Drain. This card is very obnoxious. It reduces the game to some bullshit beatdown where both players are just who can stick the biggest monster and just start attacking. And then it comes down to who has more traps to defend their monsters and who has the biggest monster. So all of the crazy, like, oh, going back and forth with Caiuses and Synchros and all that stuff doesn't really matter as much once Skill Drain is flipped. It just changes the dynamic of the entire game. It's a very, very powerful card. Fortunately for everyone, not many decks actually do side deck this card, but it is very powerful. I'm thankful that it's not really played that much because it's kind of annoying to play against and it's pretty toxic when you think about what it does. Like, I'm very glad that it's at 2 because if it was at 3, there would be decks based on just skill drain. Like, there would be skill drain decks, and it's happened in the past in formats prior to Edison. There were skill drain decks that were being built and played with, and they won tournaments and everything. And I think it happens after too. Like, skill drain was played in modern Yu-Gi-Oh very recently and some of the most toxic decks. This card is just a toxic ass card. It's very powerful. Same thing with like oppression. This card, like, if you're siding this card, it makes sense because certain matchups just cannot deal. Like, Diva Hero has a really hard time with this. Glabbeast has a hard time with this. Any kind of weird combo deck typically loses to oppression. Like, zombies can't deal with oppression either, outside of, you know, them having a Trap Stun or a Dust Tornado or whatever. And the fact that it stays there is wild. Like, you flip it, you pay 800, but then the card is still there. So whatever they tried to special summon, they're minused, and then you're just sitting there with this card still on your field. If they use 2 cards to try to synchro summon, then they're just minus 2 cards and your oppression is still there. It's insane. This card is wild. A lot of the decks that play it just main deck it, but then you see decks like Value Turbo get away with playing 1 in a main deck and then they side the second one. And Value Turbo is one of the absolute best decks in the format, and that will never change. And one of the reasons why is because it is the best Royal Oppression deck in the entire format. So yeah, Royal Oppression, another card that honestly, it doesn't even need much of an explanation. Like, you guys understand by now if you've been playing Edison format, this card is nuts. Compulse this year, I think, has really shown how good this card can be because Absolute Zero is everywhere, and there aren't many clean ways to deal with Absolute Zero, but Compulse is one of them. And it not only deals with Absolute Zero, but it can do other tricky stuff too. Like if your opponent's kind of at low life and you just want to go for game, you can Compulse their set monster or Compulse their only monster that's in the way and attack them for game. You can use it on your own monsters to save them from things like Bottomless and Deprison. It's a very versatile card, and the fact that it's chainable and can be used on your cards and their cards is amazing. So yeah, Compulse is really, really good right now, and I'm a fan of it. A lot of people have been citing it this year, including myself, and yeah, I think that we're going to continue to see this card throughout the rest of the year. Starlight Road, to me, is just like a B tier side deck card. The reason why I feel that way is because every time someone was siding Starlight Road, the opponent kind of knows about it, and they're prepared to make a counter strategy against it that is pretty effective. And what I mean by that is they just take out the cards that get Starlight Roaded outside of something like Heavy Storm. But typically, for example, Blackwings, right? If they're playing against a deck that they know will side deck Starlight Road against them, they just side out a number of Icarus attacks to make their deck less susceptible to Starlight Road. Like a lot of good Blackwing players do that. And like, sure, you could argue that every single deck, every single card on this list and all the other tier lists, people are prepared for what their opponent is going to put in. So people kind of side deck based on their opponent putting it in. But the difference is when you take the cards out of your deck that are getting hit by a side deck card, that makes the side deck card kind of bricky. Like it can make it where you have that while I don't even have what you put it in for. And that could be really, really bad. It's one of the interesting things also about deck devastation virus, because if your deck is weak to DDV, then your goal should be to lower the amount of cards that actually get hit by it in games 2 and 3 to make it not as effective. Because if you can get your opponent to flip DDV and you reveal a hand of just big monsters, they're in trouble because they're down 2 cards and you just have a string of, I don't know, tribute summons or whatever. But yeah, I feel the same way about Starlight Road, but I think Starlight Road is not as powerful of a card as deck devastation virus is in general, so that's why it's in B tier. I think Needle Sealing is a solid B tier side deck card as well. Only a few decks can really get away with playing this, but if you saw my match at Moreno Valley round 1, it hit 3 of my monsters and none of my opponents because he had a set monster, so it actually counts as set monsters, but it doesn't destroy anything that's face down. So a pretty cool card against frogs. Torrential Tribute is a god card against frogs, and this is like more copies of Torrential Tribute in a way. Like if you think about the way the frog deck plays, typically every turn they're going to at least have a Treeborn Frog, and then they're probably going to normal summon a little bit more between either Junk Synchron or Stratos or Miracle Fusion or whatever. So it's not that hard to get this off against frogs. The thing is, I think that might be the only matchup that you really want this card against. Like I don't know what else I would really want Needle Sealing against, and to have it be reliable, because that's the hard part, is make it reliable. And granted, right now the good thing is that no one is playing around Needle Sealing because it's not popular enough for people to do that yet. So it's kind of just like it's in that middle of the pack row, which is why it's in B tier. Deprison as a side deck card, I'm just going to put in B tier. I'm not a big fan of siding Deprison, to be honest. Like I feel like if you're siding this, this is a card that you really just should be maining, I think, if you're going to play it at all. I don't really know matchups where you would need to side more Deprisons that are popular. Like the popular decks, I feel like if you're siding a card like Deprison, it probably should just be Compulse. Like all the S tier decks are probably more weak to Compulse than they are Deprison. As a main deck card, this card is great. Like it's a really good card in the main deck, but we're talking about side deck cards here. And as a side deck card, like if you're using one of your 15 spaces or more than one of your 15 spaces for Deprison, I'm not the biggest fan of that. Same way I feel about Mirror Force. Like I don't really like Mirror Force as much as I like something like Torrential, although it's been a little bit better. If your deck is not known to side Mirror Force, then it has a bit more power. So it's like an A tier card if it's a surprise factor to it. But if you're just playing a deck that naturally plays battle traps and for some reason you're not playing Mirror Force and then you side it in, that seems weird to me. Like if your deck is heavy on traps, you probably just play Mirror Force, even though I do think that Mirror Force a lot of the times is worse than Deprison, but that's a completely different discussion. But like as a side deck card, Mirror Force to me is just middle of the road. The reason why I even side this card is because I basically play it against people who I think are not that good, or if I just feel like my opponent is very, very aggressive. But in terms of power level, I think that the more people realize that Mirror Force is being sided, the worse it gets. And I've talked about this in previous videos too, where I said like the absence of Mirror Force is stronger than Mirror Force a lot of the times. Like your opponent is often afraid of Mirror Force and they'll play around it, but once they see it in your graveyard, then they can put everything in attack mode without worrying about it, right? And the same is kind of true about Torrential Tribute. It's the same thing where if they see it in your graveyard, they're like, oh shit, I can just summon as many monsters as I want to and I can't get Torrential. So they start playing very aggressively. So the absence of Torrential is kind of stronger than Torrential in most cases, but the reason why I have this as an S tier, and again, is more of a biased take about the frog deck is because one, people don't expect it, but the other thing is that frogs can do some very tricky shit with Torrential Tribute, like summon swap frog, activate priority to bounce it right back to your hand, and then chain Torrential Tribute. So then you have swap frog chain link 1, Torrential chain link 2, and that can cause things to miss timing. Like, it's just a really strong play. So Torrential has a lot more playability than Mirror Force, which requires your opponent to attack. It requires your opponent to attack with all their shit in attack mode. Like, it's way more narrow. But yeah, that's kind of my spiel on that. Bottomless Trap Hole, I actually think is a pretty decent side deck card, even if your deck doesn't main it. Contrary to the way I feel about Dimensional Prison, I like Bottomless on the side because the matchups that it's good against, it's very, very strong against. So think about Black Wings. They suffer a lot against decks that just bottomless them. If you stop their summons, the deck kind of falls apart a bit. So Bottomless is really, really good against that. It's also good against Light Sworn. It's good against Christia Sworn. Yeah, Bottomless is good against any deck that plays Machina Fortress. It just makes them go absolutely minus. Also against Phoenician Cluster Amaryllis deck, same thing. Like, Bottomless is really good. It hits Titanio. It hits the actual cluster. So this card is good against a lot of different things. And banishing in this format is a big deal. I've seen in the past, like Rana, he sided 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole and Frogs. And I did try it out. It wasn't for me because of the way the frog decks that I play are built, but some of the other frog builds are really good at side decking Bottomless, and a good amount of time this could just be a turn skip. Like against Black Wings, often this is just a straight up turn skip. So really powerful card. Mind Crush is A tier against the decks that it's good against, so you only side Mind Crush against a few things, but I do think it's very good against them. For example, against Light Sworn and Christia Sworn, Mind Crush is extremely good because you typically know when they have JD or Christia or whatever, and so if your opponent goes Beckoning Light or Monster Reincarnation, both of those cards are minuses, and then to have the cards that they got back in Mind Crush is very crippling. And against Dragon Turbo, Mind Crush is great because they create their pseudo perfect hand and they go summon Debris Dragon or Instant Fusion or whatever, and right before they get to summon Red Eyes, you just Mind Crush Red Eyes. That should leave them very, very vulnerable, and typically the games end right after that. But not many people actually side Mind Crush, but I think it's a very, very powerful card in general. It's at 1, so it's unreliable in that sense, but when you do see it, it's pretty good, and it pairs well with DDV and Trap Dust Shoot. So like everyone probably remembers the days when people would Trap Dust Shoot and Mind Crush the opponent in one turn, and that, I mean, if you lose after doing that, then you need to go back to Duelist Academy or some shit, because you got to see your opponent's hand, manipulate their hand twice, if they have any multiples in their hand and they just lose them. So really crazy. Light Imprisoning Mirror, right now I'm gonna put it in B tier as well. I don't really think that there are any decks to side this against that are super popular at the moment, so it's kind of awkward to even include Light Imprisoning Mirror in your side deck. Like before, Light Imprisoning Mirror was an auto include because there were way more fairy players, there's way more Light Sworn and stuff like that, but I think that those decks have kind of died down a bit. Like sure, you'll see them top every once in a while, especially Light Sworn, but it's getting more and more rare that you run into decks that Light Mirror is super good against. Like even Light Sworn and fairies, there are other cards that are probably just better against them anyway, like DDV for example. But maybe something like Hero Beat would side this because fairies can be annoying with just walling up with their recruiters and banishing everything with DD Warrior Lady. I just think where the meta is right now, as of August 2023, like Light Mirror is not it. Now, Mask Restrict is in such an awkward place. I kind of feel like it's better than B tier, but worse than A tier. And none of this is in any particular order. Like, I'm not really going to reorder everything to be in like, oh, this is the top of A tier and then it descends. But I think if I did have to say something was at the bottom of A tier and maybe at the top of B tier, it would probably be Mask Restrict, because it does stop a lot of the things that the frog decks want to do, like Econ, Substitute, all the tribute summons for the monarchs and stuff like that. That's a pretty big deal. Soul Exchange, like if you chain it to Soul Exchange, then your opponent will probably go minus that turn unless they have an MST or Dust Tornado. So it's really good at what it does. I think the problem is that because it's a floodgate, that you typically will have to flip preemptively because you can't chain it to Econ. So if they go stand by phase, bring back Treeborn Frog, and you're like, I'm just gonna wait to see what they do, then they could go Econ, take your monster, and that might be okay in certain situations where you want them to take it and then you flip the Mask or Restrict, so they have to give it back to you. But if they happen to have something like Junk Synchron, or if you have a second monster in the field, they're going to attack over it. Like there's a lot of reasons why you want to just have it up preemptively. And so that brings the problem of having to flip it preemptively because it's a floodgate, which means that the cards that they would have used, they can't use them now. So they just store them in their hand. And this gives them opportunity to go set Dust Tornado pass or set whatever to deal with it, like trap stun and stuff like that, and pass. And then on the following turn, they can just, you know, pop off because the cards that they would have used while Mask Restrict was face down, they can't use anymore. So they're still there. So and that's what a floodgate is. A floodgate is a card that literally is holding back a flood that is trying to destroy whatever your castle is that you built on your side. So once the floodgate is gone, it's like, yeah, now here comes the Kaises, the Econs, the Substitutes, the Soul Exchanges, all that stuff. It's all still there. Like you didn't get rid of it. You just kind of made it where they couldn't use it in the moment. Now, if you can end the game very quickly, early, like Black Wings and stuff like that, Value Turbo, they can get away with Masker Restrict because they can do it, and then in like 2 turns the game's just over. 2 battle phases is you're cooked. And sure, it can conflict with things like Icarus Attack and Gemini Spark, but I'd argue that if you have Masker Restrict up on the field, you're probably winning the game anyway. You could also side out some number of copies of those cards if you really feel like it's going to be that much of a conflict, but I do think Masker Restrict is a lot better than most people think it is, and it doesn't really get sided right now because Pulling a Rug is so good. But like if regular Frog Monarchs became more popular, this card is insane against that build because it plays like 3 Soul Exchange, 3 Econ, 12 plus Monarchs, so that it's really strong against that build. Whereas Hero Frogs can be a little awkward because Hero Frogs can do all these different things. They have Stratos to pop, they have Absolute Zero plays with Miracle Fusion, Junk Synchron, like there's a lot more things that it can do against Masker Restrict. Same is true with like Raigeki Brick, because if you flip it preemptively, now I know which back row I need to hit with the Raigeki Brick, with the Dust Tornado, etc. So it does have a weakness in that regard, but I think once it resolves, if your opponent doesn't get rid of it like kind of immediately, it is really strong. Trap Hole, I typically have only ever seen this card sided against Black Wings. I don't know whatever matchup you'd want specifically Trap Hole against that you wouldn't want Bottomless Trap Hole against. So yeah, it's B tier. It's very good against Black Wings, which is one of the best decks in the format. Like it is very good, but I don't know if it's good against anything else. So it's a kind of a narrow side deck card, and it doesn't stop things that are already on the field or already happening to you. So in that way, it's kind of like, it's one of those cards that's not terrible, but not great either. If the meta shifted in a way where there was like, I don't know, some other kind of deck, maybe it's not even good against Gladbeast though, because then it can just recur whatever you trap hold with Equest. So I don't really know outside of Black Wings. Yeah, I can't really come up with anything that I think this is like super good against besides that one deck. And last but not least, Malevolent Catastrophe. So I talked about Decree, Industrial Tornado, Trap Stun, 7 Tools. I think this is like in the same tier as 7 Tools. You need your opponent to attack. You also need them to kind of commit more than one back row at a time to get any value out of it. And it reads insane. It says Heavy Storm on it when you read it, right? But then it has all these stipulations, it being a trap card and it requiring your opponent to declare an attack. And games just don't play out perfectly a lot of the times where you get a lot of value out of Malevolent Catastrophe. Like we all want our opponent set 3 with no protection and then decided to attack, and Malevolent Catastrophe got flipped and destroyed all 3 of their back rows and you won the game off of it. But like that shit does not happen. It just doesn't. Like if you've played this card before ever, you know that just does not happen. And the problem with it is that if it became popular, the counterplay against it destroys it. Like the counterplay being that people start setting 1 card per turn, or they start paying attention to when they want to attack and they don't side out Starlight Road because they know that, oh, you're siding this card in, so this is another card that Starlight Road can hit. And now their attack is going to be way more vicious because it's whatever they already had on the field plus Stardust Dragon. So there have been multiple times where I wanted to put Malevolent Catastrophe in my Frog side deck, but then I start playing actual games and I'm just getting attacked by Stratos and Alias for 3,700, and I'm like, ugh, one of his back rows is chainable to begin with, if not both of them. And 2, like this is only really going to be a +1 because they have 2 back rows set, not 3 or anything. And I'm taking half of my life to get this card resolved. So it's a tough one. If you're down bad already, it's not what you want to see as a top deck. It doesn't stop any attacks from coming in. It doesn't stop any aggression. It just kind of like, if it's the beginning of the game, it can be very strong. But outside of that, like once the game is already underway, it can be very, very bad. I'm always weary of siding things that aren't really chainable. If you look at the top of the tier list, right? Like look at the cards in S tier, look at the cards in A tier. They're pretty chainable cards in general. Pulling the Rug, Torrential, Deck Devastation Virus, Decree, Skill Drain, Depression, those are all chainables. And then Fiend, Comedian, Trap Stun, Dust Tornado, Compulse, Mind Crush, like those are also chainable cards. And I guess Bottomless 2 is technically chainable if it's something like Chainlink 1 Whirlwind, Chainlink 2 Bottomless. But the cards in B tier, they kind of require your opponent a lot, if you notice. Like 7 Tools, Malevolent Catastrophe, Starlight Road, Thief Prison, Mirror Force, Trap, like they require your opponent to really do something kind of specific. Like even Needle Sealing is very needing of your opponent because you want them to have 3 monsters on the field, if not straight up 4. And that's kind of what like separates a lot of the cards on this list. Now, D tier, like I said, those cards just are not played in modern Edison at all. Like I don't think anyone is really playing them. So anyways, let me know what you guys think about this tier list for traps. Let me know if there's any cards that you wanted me to talk about that maybe I might have missed. I think this is pretty much everything, but it's possible that there's some like crazy trap card that I'm not thinking of. And in any event, guys, I will catch you in the next one. Peace.